Last spring, we had a chapel speaker who one student, I won't mention who, told me, "Dad, that was that was the best chapel speaker I've ever heard." And so that seemed like a pretty good recommendation. And there was also sort of a buzz that maybe this person should be brought back to do a Faith and Reason lecture. And we are so pleased to have him today. Dr. Stephen Turley is an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and blogger at turleytalks.com. He's also the author of a book titled Awakening Wonder, a classical guide to truth, goodness, and beauty. Dr. Turley is a teacher of theology, Greek, and rhetoric at Tall Oaks Classical School in Newcastle, Delaware, and he's also a professor of fine arts at Eastern University. And today he's going to be talking, the title of his talk is The Restoration of Man, ? C.S. Lewis, Globalism, and the Triumph of Tradition. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Turley.
Nephilim. From my angle, there were a lot of Nephilim around all the time. Oh, forgive me, I was caught in traffic around. I thought about it. I said the same thing. I think the last time I was here. In Baltimore, the Baltimore Beltway, there was an accident there. It was horrible. And, it was not my most sanctified moment. It's great to see you all again. Before I begin, I do owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Sillers. He alerted me to a potentially embarrassing situation here on page 18 here in my talk. Third paragraph from the bottom where it says classical homeschool. I said, there are estimates that homeschool children who receive a classical education may be 10 times larger than their conventional peers. Except a small. If you're like me, you could stand to lose a couple of pounds. But I wasn't trying to insinuate anything, but now that I'm here, no, I need to call Oprah. Thank you so much for this honor, this privilege to address you here with the Faith and Reason conference, and a big congratulations to your moot court win in Dallas. You take pride in your humility. I can say, I do. I think you're being referred to more and more as the terminators of moot court competitions. So maybe that should be the new motto of Patrick Henry. It should be Patrick Henry College. We'll be back. That's and then you just slaughter your opponents. Kind of creepy, but thank you again so much for this honor. It was February 24th, 1943. Great Britain was in its fourth year of battle in World War II, a conflict that involved, according to then Prime Minister Winston Churchill, nothing less than the survival of Christian civilization. C.S. Lewis, along with his brother Warren, traveled from Oxford to the small medieval town of Durham to deliver 3 successive talks for the Riddle Memorial Lecture Series, which were founded in memory of Sir John Buchanan Riddle, a devout Christian, with the stated intention of exploring the interface between religion and contemporary thought. Lewis's brother Warren wrote in his diary that their visit to Durham was like a little oasis in the dreariness of their lives, an escape from the daily food rationing of urban British life in the midst of war. I can attest firsthand to this oasis. Much of my doctoral research was spent in the shadow of Durham's magnificent 11th century Norman cathedral at the city center, in sacred splendor nestled between castle and college. This cathedral, standing as it was against the dreary, beleaguered background of World War II, served an almost parable-like setting for the content of Lewis's lectures over the next 3 evenings during the university's Epiphany term. The first lecture began simple enough. Lewis addressed the current state of British education, which he saw as eclipsing the classical tradition's emphasis on fostering wisdom and virtue with an exclusive focus on technical competency and scientific utilitarianism. The education of old, as he would say, envisioned the world filled with divine meaning and purpose, and thus sought to foster wisdom through a knowledge of this divine meaning and purpose on the one hand, and to cultivate virtue through the right ordering of our loves in accordance with this divine economy on the other. In Lewis's words, classical education centered on, quote, the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are, close quote. Classical education sought to harmonize what we know with what we love, integrating our intellect and our appetites, exemplified in a life of wisdom and virtue. However, Lewis observed that modern education, that is the education that characterized much of mid-20th century Britain, was in effect pulling apart the head from the appetites by redefining knowledge solely in terms of scientifically verified facts, because it was supposed that facts such as 2 + 2 = 4 are value-free and that their validity transcends any person's or culture's value system. They have no moral significance. There's no objective meaning or purpose or moral integrity in the world of facts. There are, well, only facts, nothing more. In this modern reduction of the world as knowable only through value-free facts, Lewis was concerned that contemporary education was, in effect, destroying the very possibility of cultivating virtue. If virtue involved ordering our loves and organizing our sentiments in accordance with the divinely authored economy of goods, then any denial of such a divine economy in effect negated the very metaphysical basis by which our loves could be ordered. For Lewis, British education was creating a generation of young people cut off from the objective values of truth, goodness, and beauty, and thereby depriving them of the very transcendent means by which their humanity flourished. But as the lectures developed, it was clear that Lewis was not merely concerned with educational curriculum and pedagogy. For Lewis, these two divergent educational approaches represent nothing less than two fundamentally different human projects, what could be considered two fundamentally different ages or civilizations, what we might call a moral age versus the modern age, or a sapient age versus a scientific age. Lewis summarizes these two ages thusly. For classical man, that is pre-modern man, the fundamental question was, how do I conform my soul to the world around me and thus be drawn up into divine life? And the answer was through prayer, virtue, knowledge, wisdom, and the like. However, for modern man, the question is inverted. Modern man is not interested in how to conform the soul to reality. Instead, modern man asks, how do I conform the world to my own desires and my own ambitions? You see, here wisdom, virtue, prayer, they're not going to help you. Instead, the answer involves tapping into those institutions that operate by the mechanisms of power and manipulation, namely science, technology, and the secular state. Now, what Lewis observes is that these two contrasting visions of reality entail two contrasting visions of education. Perhaps one of the more profound observations that Lewis makes is that education is inescapably enculturation. Education is a means by which one is initiated into a culture, into a particular way of being human. For Lewis, the significance of scientific utilitarianism in British education was that it marked the triumphant arrival of the modern age and its assumptions pervading British culture, reconstituting all cultural institutions according to secular rules, understandings, and goals. But Lewis is not merely a critic of this civilizational shift. He's not a cynical curmudgeon or what he calls an obscurantus, one who simply laments the death of the old order and the rise of the new one, those crazy kids today, kind of thing. Now, Lewis believes that this propensity, this orientation toward power and manipulation inherent in the modernist experiment is nothing less than a threat to our humanity as we have known it. If all of reality has been reduced to value-free nature, being understood solely through scientifically defined facts, then even humanity itself will be seen as nothing more than mere nature. And if nature is there to be manipulated to the wants and the desires of others, then inevitably the vast majority of humanity will be vulnerable to scientific and technological manipulation according to the needs of a technocratic elite. It's then when man will have thought he finally conquered nature, but nature will have conquered man. For man as such would cease to exist. A new social order will arise that subsumes the vast majority of humanity under the category of impersonal nature, which in effect redefines humanity as inherently meaningless, hence the title of the publication of his lectures, The Abolition of Man. A number of commentators have since echoed Lewis's dire warning. Peter Kraft observes that the abolition of man, quote, is a terrifying prophecy of mortality, not just the mortality of modern Western civilization, but the mortality of human nature itself if we do not recapture belief in what Lewis calls the Tao, the natural law, the doctrine of objective values, close quote. As part of this prophecy of mortality, Lewis identified two fundamental flaws in the modern project that were available for all to see if they would but take a moment to reflect. First, he saw the doubt and skepticism intrinsic to modern epistemology and ethics as inherently self-negating. The secularized standards by which the modern skeptic debunks religious thought and sentiment can just as easily be applied to those very secularized standards. Secondly, he logically traced out the propensity towards technocratic tyranny inherent in a world governed according to these self-defeating modernist assumptions. Lewis argued that there was only one way to counter and resist these twin futilities. We must turn back to what he calls the Tao, the doctrine of objective values, as the only source for what he calls a, quote, regenerate science, close quote, and a truly humane vision of life. In Lewis's words, quote, only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny or an obedience which is not slavery, close quote. But is this possible? Can we really see a mass return in a world so infused with the values of scientific progress and technological advance? We hear it all the time. Hey, man, you can't go back. Can modern man who believes he has evolved beyond our infantile past still heed the summons of Lewis and become as little children born anew? I believe the answer to this is an emphatic yes. I believe we today are in the midst of a mass rebellion against this modernist experiment Lewis so profoundly described. Indeed, a recent study on the worldwide resurgence of religion and its challenge to secular modernity was aptly titled Global Rebellion. And this rebellion appears to be launching a twofold front exemplative of Lewis's analysis. On the one hand, postmodernist thought is calling out the self-defeating notion of scientifically inspired epistemology and ethics. And on the other hand, a renewal of religious nationalism throughout the world is reawakening pre-modern beliefs and practices as mechanisms of resistance against what are perceived as secularizing, indeed tyrannizing processes of globalization. And to bring this full circle, in the midst of this global rebellion, we're seeing the renewal of the very classical education that Lewis so ably defended, and with it, the awakening of wisdom and virtue so indispensable to our human flourishing. As such, the abolition of man does in fact turn out to be a prophecy, but not a dire one regarding the mortality of human civilization, but rather the hope of its restoration. One of the first indicators that the dominance of scientific rationalism was beginning to wane appeared in 1979 in a book published by the French philosopher and sociologist Jean-François Lyotard, entitled The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. Now, as stated in his opening paragraph, Lyotard argued that since the end of the 1950s and the reconstruction of Europe, the West has been entering what he called a postmodern age. Lyotard defines postmodern simply as, quote, an incredulity toward meta-narratives, close quote, a one-size-fits-all vision of knowledge in the world that transcends time, place, culture, people. Lyotard refers to this condition as postmodern precisely because he sees a scientific meta-narrative at the heart of modernity. Moderns consider science and scientific laws as valid for all people, times, and places, such that pre-modern religious beliefs and practices have ceded authority to forms of truth and reasoning that no longer require religious grounding. The modernization story had hitherto provided the one narrative of progress and competence in relation to which all spheres of Western life had been shaped and defined. What Lyotard argued was that Western populations had grown increasingly skeptical of this world vision. Instead, he noticed that the modern world was becoming increasingly dominated by a plurality of cultural commitments and lifestyles, with no consensus as to the veracity of any one over the other. As a consequence, the fundamental tenet of modernity, that's going to be key to this argument, the fundamental tenet of modernity, the universality of scientific rationality as the sole objective way of knowing the world, had in effect collapsed in the hearts and minds of most Westerners. Instead, it was increasingly recognized that the scientific meta-narrative, the secular claim to absolute and universal truth, was itself nothing more than a mere cultural construct, just one of innumerable life worlds and cultural commitments. Simply put, the postmodern condition rendered modernity just another culture, nothing more. The collapse of the modernist meta-narrative has grown most evident in, surprise, surprise, the university, particularly in the United States. In his book, The Decline of the Secular University, C. John Somerville argues that the commitment to secularization of modern research university, it in effect abandoned the conception of what it meant to be human, which of course was C.S. Lewis's chief concern in the Abolition of Man. Because the secular entails a materialistic reductionism, questions concerning the nature of what it means to be human they've been basically rendered obsolete. The question is simply too religious in nature to be answered by a secularized institution. This loss of human and moral formation in the modern university led to a vacuum, which was filled with the rise of so-called multiculturalism, which first appeared on American college campuses in the 1960s with the Third World Movement, a coalition of Black, Native American, Asian, Latino students concerned about the disenfranchisement of racial minorities. As Roger Kimball details in his 1990 study, Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Our Higher Education, the traditional literary canon, central to the liberal arts vision, was increasingly relegated to an expanding literature centered on gender, race, and sexuality. So instead of the masterpieces of Western culture, students at Stanford, for example, could take a class on the Navajos called Our Bodies, Our Sheep, Our Cosmos, Ourselves. I think you have that class here, don't you? With the loss of any overarching meta-narrative, multicultural theorists began to view personal and institutional relationships through the prism of power discrepancies. Take, for example, the new racial logic that's emerged of late, one that reimagines culture as a binary of antithetical power distributions between a dominant colonialist power, often labeled white, that disenfranchises politically and socially minority cultures through sexist, racist, and classist exclusions. Such a paradigm has forged a new conception of racism specific to systems of power and domination. This prejudice plus power paradigm was well represented by a manual compiled by affirmative action officer Carolyn Pitts in the 1980s, who asserts that in the United States, quote, only whites can be racists, since whites dominate and control the institutions that create and enforce American cultural norms and values. Blacks and other third world peoples do not have access to the power to enforce any prejudices that they may have, so they cannot, by definition, be racist, close quote. That's the prejudice plus power definition of racism. Needless to say, the primacy of power in human and institutional relationships leaves little room for the modernist notion of scientific or secularized truth. A recent example of this involved a letter written by some of your peers, but at Pomona College. I just think it's so funny that Pomona, the first four letters are Pomo, but we'll move on from there. That went over about 80% of your heads. You're going to find that so funny tomorrow, I promise you. They sent a letter, they responded to a letter by the president of Pomona College that reaffirmed their mission, the university's mission, as one, quote, founded upon the discovery of truth, the collaborative development of knowledge, and the betterment of society, close quote. Here's what the students had to say about that. Historically, white supremacy has venerated the idea of objectivity and wielded a dichotomy of subjectivity versus objectivity as a means of silencing oppressed peoples. The idea that there's a single truth, the truth, is a construct of the Euro-West that is deeply rooted in the Enlightenment, which was a movement that also described black and brown people as both subhuman and impervious to pain. This construction is a myth. The idea that the truth is an entity for which we must search in matters that endanger our abilities to exist in open spaces is an attempt to silence oppressed people. I mean, we've actually come to the point now where truth is racist. It is no wonder, then, that in the face of the perceived threat of power discrepancies, multiculturalism is increasingly collapsing into tribalism, a danger recognized decades ago by Arthur Schlesinger. As evidenced by the Black Lives Matter movement, La Raza, and what Carol Swain refers to as the new white nationalists, tribalist sentiments go beyond a mere rejection of the values of modernity, championing a racial and cultural identity that embraces social fission, extreme differentiation, and ethnic-based segmentation. And yet, in this tribalized rejection of the Enlightenment, postmodernists reveal their own futilities and contradictions. While rejecting the modernist monopoly on truth claims, they ironically accept the modernist redefinition of the world as inherently devoid of any divine meaning and purpose, apart from what cultures choose to impart to it. As such, postmodernists fall prey to the very consequences that Lewis predicted would always occur once the Tao is denied. In a world devoid of objective values, all that exists is power and manipulation. Moreover, in rejecting meta-narratives in favor of the pursuit of power, postmodernists simply substitute the arbitrariness of the scientific meta-narrative, surprise, surprise, with their own. To the extent that current protesters and activists continue to embrace categories and distinctions specific to secularism, they are merely perpetuating the contradictions that toppled their modernist progenitor, thus securing their own eventual overthrow as well. So, why do postmodernists reject modernity's truth claims while simultaneously accepting its vision of reality? A world devoid of any divine meaning and purpose. Oh, that coffee tastes so good. Sorry. Thank you, Stephen. Oh my, it was so cold out there, and I was, I'm home. Okay. Sorry. So, why do postmodernists reject modernity's truth claims and yet accept its vision of the world? The British sociologist Anthony Giddens sees the postmodern contradiction as the fruit of the phenomenon we call globalization. For Giddens, Lyotard's postmodern condition is the result of our collective, he calls it's a disillusionment in being caught up within this mass technological world we don't quite understand and feels largely outside of our control. Giddens defines modernity not as a belief system or a philosophy, right, the ascendancy of scientific rationalism, but more as a social order that profoundly influences our vision of the world and our place within it. As a social order, modernity is comprised of the industrialization of material power and machinery, as well as the interaction between capitalism, urbanization, technology, telecommunications. In such a complex world, Giddens argues that postmoderns can reject modernity philosophically, all the while accepting modernity socially. This philosophical social dichotomy is all the more intensified by globalization, which emerges when this modernist social order extends beyond the West, interweaving transnational, indeed transcontinental levels of human organization into more or less a single political and economic system. At its most basic, globalization involves a pervasive dialectic between the local and the global through a process known as disembedding. Disembedding refers to the ways in which our daily routines and practices are no longer defined by their grounding, their embeddedness in the local context of restricted time and place. For example, think about how we tell time today. I've got an example right in front of me. We all know how time was kept in traditional societies. In accordance with ecology, the perceived position of the sun in the sky, we could put the moon in there as well in lunar calendars, and with rituals that gave such ecological movement its meaning. However, today we keep time with a machine, the mechanical clock. Our lives are organized temporally by regulated mechanisms and time zones. This means that the time of, say, noon is the same in Maine as it is in the westernmost part of Ohio, regardless of the sun's proximity to its meridian for those respective regions. Just as a little anecdote, there's a beautiful, I don't know if you've ever been to Longwood Gardens in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. It's absolutely beautiful. It's like 1,000+ acres, DuPont estate of just horticulture on steroids. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. It's a garden. I take my class there every year as sort of a redeeming of the senses kind of thing. And I could still remember, they have a sundial, and I was there with my wife, and we're walking, and I looked at the time, and I looked at the time on the sundial, and I looked at the time on, I think, with my watch on my phone, and there was an hour discrepancy. And I looked at the sundial and said, oh, look, it's wrong. And even my wife looked at me and said, take it up with the sun. I don't know where you file a grievance there. But. So it was, in other words, we just unconsciously, through osmosis, we just absorbed the normalcy of machines and technocracy. It's as natural, even more natural, than the world around us. Similarly, the modern age is characterized by disembedded space. Whether we're talking about the phone, or television, internet, or email, our modern society is characterized by processes that transcend localities. Today, we can be closer to someone 10,000 miles away via a cell phone than we are to the person we're sitting next to at Starbucks. However, disembedding is not limited to time and space. Such dislodging also involves localized customs, traditions, languages, and religions, a process known as de-traditionalization. Modern disembedding involves various secularizing mechanisms by which local customs and traditions are relativized to wider economic, scientific, and technocratic forces. Whereas pre-modern societies are characterized generally by provincial beliefs and practices considered sacred and absolute, globalized societies offer a range of consumer-based options that call into question the sanctity of local beliefs and practices, relativizing them to a global food court of many other creedal alternatives. As a result, traditional moral codes and customs become increasingly implausible to objectively sustain. For Giddens, detraditionalizing processes provide moderns with more lifestyle choices than ever, emancipating them from the supposedly arbitrary controls and definitions indicative of traditional societies. As autonomous individuals exercising sovereign control over their own life circumstances, the absolute veracity of a single meta-narrative becomes highly improbable. So that's how he accounts for how you have postmodernists rejecting the secular meta-narrative but adopting secular conception of the world. And yet, Giddens' account for the postmodern contradiction itself runs into its own intractable obstacles, most especially his admission that moderns exercise control over their own lives while simultaneously living in a technocratic world over which they have no control. We may have lots of choices locally, but we're feeling more and more helpless globally. Indeed, globalization appears to be forging the very two classes of people that Lewis believed inexorably emerge in a world governed by scientific and technological processes, what he called the conditioners and the conditioned, and it's in chapter 3 of Abolition of Man. Globalism is organized around what Giddens calls expert systems that operate according to standardized and specialized technical knowledge and protocols. From the building codes embedded in our homes and buildings to the dependability of our automobiles and the safety of roads and bridges, air travel, iPhones, etc., we find ourselves increasingly trusting in and indeed dependent upon a class of technological experts for the management of our daily lives. According to Lewis, the danger here is that as more and more people become dependent on technological expertise, technocracies are inevitably ruled by experts and engineers who convince the masses that such competencies are the basis for their freedom and prosperity, a reliance that renders humanity particularly vulnerable to comparable manipulation. Another anecdote there, I lived in Maryland for a number of years, and I'll never forget seeing the name on the card for cash assistance, otherwise known as food stamps. Do you know what the cash assistance card is called in Maryland? The Independence card. The Independence card. This is, for Lewis, the genius of the modern age. Technocracies are inevitably ruled by experts and engineers who convince the masses that such competencies are the basis for their freedom and prosperity. You are more free the more control I have. Today we can see how globalization has reorganized the world around a class of experts who have largely redefined political and economic protocols in the form of what could be called really a de facto world government, replete with its own transnational institutions, European Union, European Court of Human Rights, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, G7, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and the like. It's through such world institutions that the modernist West seeks to export the social order distinctive to globalization in the forms of liberal democracy, free markets, and human rights. And with the major alternatives to this global world order, fascism and communism, now dead and buried, scholars such as Francis Fukuyama have postulated that globalism may in fact represent the climactic and inevitable world system of human history. In other words, there's basically nothing beyond liberal democracies in social development. And yet, as sociologist Stepan Mostrovich notes, the confidence in this brave new world exemplified by the architects and managers of these institutions is not shared by all. In fact, there's nothing short of a global groundswell of resistance against this standardized and mechanistic recalibration of the world. What appears to be happening is through a process known as segmentary oppositions, which I'm not going to get into. The localized tribalisms forged in the postmodern response to the threat of disproportionate power relations have reconfigured into translocal forms of nationalist and populist sentiments and political organization. In Europe, for example, there's been nothing less than a surge of right-wing and populist parties dedicated to overturning the disembedding effects of globalism and its de facto one-world government. In the past 17 years, the actual number of nationalist and populist parties across the European continent has nearly doubled, growing from 33 to 63. All these parties are seeing extraordinary electoral success. The share of votes won by populist parties in Europe has tripled in the course of such time, from 8.5% of the European vote to nearly 25%. Since the spring of 2010, there have been over a dozen parliamentary elections throughout Western Europe. And we could see the electoral surge of nationalist populist parties throughout these elections. In March of 2017, Geert Wilders' Dutch Freedom Party came in second place, a marked difference from 2006 when they came in fifth place. We've seen a comparable surge with the Flemish Nationalist and Secessionist Party in Belgian parliamentary elections, along with the rise of the Swedish Democrats and the anti-European party, the True Finns. Marine Le Pen doubled the support of National Front in her presidential campaign against the centrist Macron. That's in Italy, in France, rather. In Italy, there was a recent mass sweep of center-right candidates winning the vast majority of mayoral elections, with Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party and the anti-immigrant Northern League party trouncing their left-wing rivals by winning over 55% of the vote. They have an election, a full parliamentary election on March 4th. And right now, as we stand, the polls show that center-right to far-right have a 70% advantage. The so-called Visegrad 4, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, all have nationalist governments hostile to the EU's immigration quotas, a hostility bolstered of late by Austria's electoral turn to the right and the rise of the far-right party, Alternative for Germany, the AfD, in their latest round of elections. In the most recent year of elections to date, 2017, the center-left all but collapsed throughout Europe. A total of 946 districts held political elections that year, and the center-left coalitions held their own or improved in a mere 56 districts, just under 6%. According to The Guardian's analysis of British paper, in almost 94% of districts, the center-left lost out to center-right, nationalist or so-called far-right parties, as well as populist left parties like the Bernie Sanders kind of thing, which were often as hostile to the Eurozone as the far-right. The New York Times assessment was nothing short of dire. Quote, in most major Western European, notice Western, we're not talking Central and Eastern, okay? Most major Western European countries, center-left parties are in retreat, and in some cases, they've practically ceased to exist. Close quote. What accounts for this mass global rebellion against the technocratic promises of globalization? There appear to be at least two interconnected dynamics propelling this blowback. On the one hand, there's an increasing consensus among non-Western nations that globalism represents nothing less than a foreign invasion, a kind of invasive cultural imperialism. And as phrases such as the bullies in Brussels, and that's Nigel Farage, and European populist rhetoric evidences, even Western nations are accusing institutions such as the European Union of totalitarian tendencies. And on the other hand, these power discrepancies are exasperated by what Cornell sociologist Mabel Berezin has identified as 3 insecurities inherent in globalized dynamics. Berezin notes that the nation-state historically promised to provide secure borders, a stable economy, and space for the celebration and perpetuation of a population's culture and traditions, customs, religion. But as Berezin observes, these 3 securities have eroded as a result of the dynamics inherent in globalization. First, because the constituents of globalization, such as transnational corporations, electronic money, transcend national borders. Many scholars believe that globalization is bringing an end to the whole concept of distinct nations. And as Paul Harris has observed, these porous borders, which serve to expedite flows of goods within a globalized economy, entails a significant increase in levels of immigration, both legal and illegal. Moreover, the threat of terrorism only exaggerates the anxieties over the porous borders, rendering border insecurities a seemingly permanent part of our political and national landscapes. Secondly, globalization tends to negate local industry with a global division of labor that relocates manufacturing to the so-called global south, while finance and ownership of capital coalesces around the west, and particularly in urban centers. As a result, the last few decades have been characterized by a mass exodus of industrial and manufacturing jobs from the United States and Western Europe into these so-called third world or global south nations such as Mexico and China. The economic collapse of 2008 hit Europe hard, but particularly the young. Net employment in the Eurozone fell by about 6 million between 2008 and 2013, and half of those affected were under the age of 25. So it's hardly surprising that millennials' confidence in the European Union for economic integration has imploded. For example, in Spain, only about 30% of the youth support the EU, while in Italy, it's down to just 12%. They did a study on the election of Marine Le Pen, who was running against Emmanuel Macron in France, and they found somewhere around like 40% of her support were from voters under the age of 25. Young people are turning to the far right in droves in that sense. Thirdly, border and economic insecurities are rivaled by ontological or cultural insecurity. We noted earlier that one of the consequences of the disembedding dynamics in globalization is what scholars call de-traditionalization. Once social life is caught up in a global industrialized economic system, it's propelled away from traditional national and local practices and beliefs. As a result, traditional moral codes and customs become increasingly implausible to objectively sustain, and populations increasingly sense that the beliefs and practices so central to their historic cultural identity are withering away. And so as Berezin concludes, the globalized emergence of these insecurities has provided the political context and climate in which nationalist populist solutions to political issues appear plausible and normal. And this rightward turn is hardly limited to Europe. Studies of the Israeli electorate found that elections held within a few months of a terrorist attack caused an increase in support of the political right, even within left-leaning localities. Another study detailed how repeated exposure to rocket threats shifted Israeli vote support to right-wing nationalists consistently throughout 2003 to 2009 elections. A comparable turn towards nationalist parties has been observed in Turkey in response to attacks by Kurdish PKK militants. Similarly, a recent article entitled 2016 Was the Year of the Wall reluctantly admits that the global right is successfully tightening borders throughout the world. They cite India's border with Pakistan and Bangladesh, Israel and Palestine, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, along with border walls in France, Hungary, Austria, Italy, and Greece. It appears as if everywhere we look, border walls are going up. They're not coming down. And far from being Berlin walls, they tend to be built around sentiments that seek to protect culture, religion, tradition, language, land, and custom. Which leads us then to perhaps the most significant development in this mass turn to the right. In the face of threats to a sense of place, identity, and security, populations tend to reassert historic identity and security markers, such as religion, custom, and tradition, as mechanisms of resistance against secular globalization's anti-cultural, anti-traditional dynamics. Or in Kinvol's words, quote, as individuals feel vulnerable and experience existential anxiety, it is not uncommon for them to wish to reaffirm a threatened self-identity. Any collective identity that can provide such security is a potential pole of attraction, close quote. As a result, the anti-traditionalist dynamics inherent in globalization have elicited a blowback, what scholars are calling re-traditionalization, a renewed interest in, quote, traditions of wisdom that have proved their validity through the test of time, or a longing for spiritual traditions and practices that have stood the test of time and therefore can be valued as authentic resources for spiritual renewal, close quote. With post-security polity as our backdrop, the important point here is that re-traditionalization is not limited simply to spiritual renewal or religious revival, like at a private level. It often involves a totalizing reconfiguration of society, a reconfiguration of political, cultural, and yes, educational norms around pre-modern religious beliefs and practices as a response to the secularizing processes of globalization. Examples of retraditionalization abound. In Russia, reference has been made to the notion of spiritual security as a subset of national security in a number of policy documents issued by the Putin government. In 2000, the national security concept of Russia stated that the assurance of the Russian Federation's national security included protecting the nation's cultural, spiritual, and moral legacy and the historical traditions and standards of public life. Spiritual security accounts for the astonishing rise to prominence experienced by the Russian Orthodox Church in just the last 3 decades. John Burgess's recent study documents how, after its near complete decimation under the communist regime, I should tell you that, in 1991, there were 600 total churches in Russia. Today, there are 36,000. 800 monasteries, I think there were barely 10, and innumerable welfare and educational ministries spread throughout the nation. The most recent surveys corroborate that, again, I should say, 1991, 30% of Russians identified as Orthodox Christians. Now it's 70%. And an astonishing 93% affirmed their support and respect for the Russian Orthodox Church and Orthodox Christians. A recent survey even found that 30% of Russians would like to see a return of the Tsar. That's called retraditionalization. King George. No, I'm not. No. We're seeing the rise of religious nationalism. I mean, big time. I have some of my students who have left India because of this, who are Christians, and they've relocated to the United States, literally as a kind of asylum. We're seeing the rise of religious nationalism, particularly in India, with the mass electoral success of the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the right-wing party of India. It's the largest democratic political party in the world. If you think things are really bad, right, just remember by far the largest Democrat political party in the world is a religious right party. The party's leader and the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, comes from a Hindu nationalist group that explicitly seeks to reorganize the Indian nation, society, and culture around conservative Hindu beliefs and practices. In Central Europe, Poland held a Catholic Mass aired on national television November of 2016, declaring Jesus Christ as King and Lord over their nation in the presence of Prime Minister Andrzej Duda. Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary is championing the defense of Christian civilization over and against the secular globalization represented by the European Union. Eastern European nations such as Georgia have reintroduced Orthodox Christianity back into their public school system. In Turkey, a number of scholars have noted that both President Erdogan and his party, the AKP, or the Justice and Development Party, are interested in actually transforming the once secular democratic republic into a neo-Anatolian federation of Muslim ethnicities, a transformation that may even involve a revived caliphate. In the Pacific, the Parliament of Samoa recently declared the island a Christian nation with a constitution dedicated explicitly to the Holy Trinity. There's a revival of imperial Shintoism at the highest levels of the Japanese government, a revitalization of Confucian philosophy among Chinese officials. We can go on and on. Indeed, sociologist Rodney Stark argues that we are currently in the midst of the single greatest religious surge the world has ever seen. According to the authors of God's Century, traditional religions throughout the world, quote, enjoy greater capacity for political influence today than at any time in modern history and perhaps ever, close quote. As it turns out, postmodern sensibilities appear particularly prone towards resolving their innate paradoxes in retraditionalization. Because the postmodern notion of truth is open and unfixed, the experience of sacred and divine reality is fully within the realm of possibility. And because identity is fluid, a postmodern world finds such an experience in its traditional forms highly desirable, especially in terms of how it might overcome the extreme fragmentation of postmodern life with meaningful commitments and integration. Indeed, it thus appears that the twin futilities of the modern experiment identified by Lewis, its epistemological, ethical incoherence, and its propensity towards technocratic tyranny are both ultimately resisted in a convergence around retraditionalization. The implications of this retraditionalization for the 21st century are frankly incalculable. Take, for example, the latest findings in demography. According to University of London scholar Eric Kaufman's detailed study in global demographic trends, we're in the early stages nothing less than what he calls a demographic revolution. In Kaufman's words, he uses the term religious fundamentalists. Quote, religious I would say traditionalists. Religious sounds like Ayatollah or something. Quote, religious fundamentalists are on course to take over the world, close quote. This is because there's a significant demographic deficit between secularists and conservative religious, and he finds this everywhere in all the civilizations that he examines. For example, in the United States, while self-identified non-religious women average only 1.5 children per couple, conservative evangelical women average 2.5 children, representing a 28% fertility edge. Kaufman notes that this demographic deficit has dramatic effects over time. In a population evenly divided, these numbers indicate that conservative evangelicals in just a single generation, it would shift, this 50-50 would shift to 62.5. So what is it, 60-40, right? In 2 generations, it'd be 75-25. In 200 years, it'd be 99% to 1%. The Amish and Mormons provide contemporary illustrations of the compound effect of endogamous growth. The Amish double in population every 20 years, and it ain't conversions, I can tell you that. And projections have the Amish numbering over 1 million in the United States and Canada in just a few decades. Since 1830, Mormon growth has averaged 40% per decade, which means that by 2080, there may be as many as 267 million Mormons in the world, making them by 2100 anywhere from 1% to 6% of the world's population. In Europe, immigration has ironically made the continent more religiously conservative, not less. In fact, London and Paris are some of the most religiously dense areas within their respective populations. In Britain, for example, ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews constitute only 17% of the Jewish population, but they account for 75% of Jewish births. And in Israel, Haredi school children have gone from comprising a few percent to nearly a third of all Jewish pupils in a matter of 5 decades, and are poised to represent the majority of the Jewish population by 2050. Since 1970, charismatic Christians in Europe have expanded steadily at a rate of 4% per year, in step with Muslim growth. Currently, Laestadian Lutherans in Finland and Holland's Orthodox Calvinists have a fertility advantage over their wider secular populations of 4-to-1 and 2-to-1, respectively. I don't know how many of you know, the Netherlands has a Bible Belt. Are you familiar with that? It's pretty wild. Yeah, Netherlands has a Bible Belt. Yeah. And they even have their own political party that represents them. In contrast, Kaufman's data projects that secularists who consistently exemplify a low fertility rate of around 1.5, significantly below the replacement level of 2.1, will begin a steady decline after, look at that date, that's 12 years away, 2030, to a mere 14 to 15% of the American population. Similar projections apply to Europe as well. Rodney Stark has, it's longer. In Europe, it's going to take about 4 generations before you start seeing a conservative religious majority there. Kaufman thus appears to have identified what he calls the soft underbelly of secularism, namely demography. This is because secular liberalism entails its own demographic contradiction, the affirmation of the sovereign individual, devoid of the restraints of classical moral structure. Shall we call that the Tao? Necessitates the freedom not to reproduce. The link between sex and procreation having been broken, modernist reproduction translates into mere personal preference. It thus turns out that the radical individualism so celebrated and revered by contemporary secular propagandists is in fact the agent by which their ideology implodes. I couldn't help it. I wrote an article, I think it was published by Christian Post, and it was titled like, why the Women's March guarantees a more conservative future. Really rub it in. March away. March away. You aren't having if you compare the amount of children that are had by the pro-life marchers versus the amount of children had by the Women's March, we win. You ever see My Big Fat Greek Wedding? I'm not kidding. You ever see My Big Fat Greek Wedding? Do you remember the wedding scene? So what's her name? Is it Tula? Tula and her Greek family, right? The Greek Orthodox family fill the church on one side. And Ian Miller, the secular kid, he's got him and like 4 people. That's what Kaufman's getting at here. Lewis certainly had a sense of this, particularly as it pertained to the modern use of and attitudes towards contraception. Absent the doctrine of objective values, the conquest over nature entails the conquest over human nature. As scientific manipulation has reduced reality to nature, man himself becomes merely a byproduct of nature and therefore a legitimate object of control. This is how Lewis understood modern contraception, where earlier generations, in effect, exercised control over later ones. However, as Kaufman has demonstrated, this calculus is turning out to be just another factor in secular modernity's demise. Indeed, with the revitalization of pro-natal sentiments among conservative Christians throughout the globe, we come full circle with Lewis's concerns in the Abolition of Man, which centered on the nature of education and its role in initiating students into a particular cultural vision of what it means to be truly human. For at the heart of retraditionalization, particularly here in the United States, we're seeing nothing less than a renaissance of the very education to which Lewis summoned our return, and you are it. According to the Association of Classical Christian Schools membership statistics, there were 10 classical schools in the nation in 1994. Today, there are over 230. Since 2002, student enrollment in classical schools has more than doubled from 17,000 nationwide to over 41,000. And these are just ACCS-affiliated schools. There are estimates that classical Christian schools now number upwards of over 500 in the nation. Classical homeschool organizations, yay, such as Classical Conversations, have also thrived with a current student enrollment of over 60,000. And again, there are estimates that the amount of homeschool children who receive a classical education may be 10 times larger than their conventional peers. That's coming from curriculum vendors, which is very interesting. That's where that stat comes from. We're also seeing among Catholic schools a mass shift towards rediscovering anew the ancient or traditional way of approaching education. You've all had Anthony Esolen here, I see, and he's one of the big major proponents of this movement. A recent example involves an entire diocese of schools in Michigan, an entire diocese, who have rejected Common Core by returning to a distinctively Catholic liberal arts education. Moreover, we're seeing the development of networks and organizations such as the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education and annual conferences that are providing the professional development necessary for a vibrant faculty administration. The charter school movement as well, now representing 10% of publicly funded schools, is becoming fertile ground for classical education. The Great Hearts Academies operates currently 25 public charter schools in Arizona and Texas, which together enroll 13,000 students with, get this, another 13,000 on waiting lists. The Barney Initiative of Hillsdale College is the second largest network of public classical schools, serving over 6,000 students spanning 7 states. Altogether, the total number of classical charter schools may be upwards of 150 in the nation. By the way, I didn't put this, we can add also honors colleges appearing on university campuses to counter these our sheep, our bodies, ourselves kind of classes. There were less than 24 honors colleges in the mid-1990s. Now there are just shy of 1,000. They're just exploding, and they're trying to bring back the liberal arts tradition as best they can, and even, you know, I'll say it, and even sort of committed globalists like Fareed Zakaria of CNN and David Brooks, the New York Times, have just basically come out and said, this is the education of our future leaders. They have to have this kind of education. And we're already seeing the effects of this kind of education. As of 2015, classically educated students had the highest SAT scores in each of the 3 categories of reading, math, and writing among all independent religious and public schools. In fact, even the SAT and ACT are being rivaled by the advent of the CLT, or the Classical Learning Test. Did anyone take that? Yeah, I see one. It's just a couple of years old. There you go. I thought everybody did. Sorry. Everyone else is moving away from her. The Classical Learning Test is an evaluation that's far more reflective of a classical and Christian education than what's represented by contemporary standardized testing. And this represents, I think, the beginning of a real transformation in education assessment that has profound implications for what we consider to be an educated person in an increasingly post-secular world. The CLT resembles other standardized tests, but it breaks the area of verbal reasoning down into 4 subcategories: philosophy, religion, natural science, literature, historical founding documents. Though only a couple years old, over 90 colleges have agreed to accept the scores for CLT instead of SAT and ACT, and more than 300 high schools across the country are serving as centers for CLT testing. But more than all of this, the renaissance of classical education is once again placing wisdom and virtue at the center of educational renewal. As Lewis noted, quote, "Until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it, believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt." He then summons some of history's greatest minds as witnesses to such a view of the world. In particular, he cites Augustine's conception of virtue as ordo amoris, the right ordering of our loves. Augustine is drawing from here a similar tradition as Aristotle, who defines education as teaching the student to like and dislike what he ought. And such well-trained dispositions lead to a virtuous life. So too Plato in his Republic, who writes that the well-nurtured youth is one who loves what's truly lovely and desires what's truly desirable. Just as a quick side note, this is something I try to give to my students, particularly the biblical context. Genesis 1, God creates, and what does he say over and over again? And it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And then he creates man, and he says, and it was very good, right? Tov, right? And it's interesting, the Septuagint, and its that Greek translation, uses the word kalos for there, which means beautiful. And it was beautiful, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. So the true one is creating a good and beautiful world. And then what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to love it the way God loves it. But what does Eve do in Genesis 3, right, the description, is she desires what she shouldn't, right? She finds something good for which she shouldn't, which God says no. And so she falls. Adam falls. And then God gives Moses the law. And what are the two greatest commandments? Or if you could sum it all in one word, as Paul does, the whole law can be summed up in love. Love rightly. Divine economy of goods, and love it rightly. Wisdom, virtue. In light of this larger retraditionalization dynamic, it is no coincidence that we are seeing a return to precisely this vision of education. We are once again cultivating wisdom and teaching students to discern the divine economy of goods, seeing the world analogous to how God sees it. And in turn, we're cultivating virtue by learning to conform our loves and our desires with just such a divine economy. That's why we read the books that we do. That's why we listen to the music. That's why we recite the poetry. As such, the current classical renewal represents a move beyond mere tribalist and nationalist blowbacks. We're seeing nothing less than a return of the education for a flourishing humanity and the realization of Lewis's hope, the restoration of man. I do not pretend to know C.S. Lewis's mind on these matters, whether he specifically pretended the demise of the secular age, but he did identify two fundamental futilities in modernity that have since turned out to be fatal to its vision of knowledge and ethics, along with its technocratically inspired world order. And I can't help but think he had a sense of how things would in fact transpire in the future. I've recently developed a renewed appreciation of the final volume of Lewis's space trilogy entitled That Hideous Strength. In the preface, Lewis described the story of a fictional depiction of the ideas he developed in the Abolition of Man. Subtitled A Modern Fairy Tale for Grown-Ups, That Hideous Strength was published in 1945, but finished just a few months after he delivered the threefold lectures in Durham. So we know that Lewis was writing the story when he delivered these lectures. As anticipated by the third and last chapter of Abolition, That Hideous Strength is a novel that explores what the world would be like if it was ruled by a technocratic elite no longer restrained by traditional values and morality. The title borrows from a line from the 16th century poem by Sir David Lindsay that describes the original Tower of Babel. As such, Lewis reveals his interpretation of the secularizing dynamics in the modern age. For Lewis, this eclipse of religion and virtue by the rise of a Babel-like scientific technocracy is ultimately a spiritual battle between angels and demons and the forces of light and truth against those of darkness and deception. Lewis did not view our modern scientific age as merely the latest chapter of inevitable progress and societal evolution. This was and remains a deeply spiritual battle where the powers and principalities of the world become incarnate through a scientific priesthood that seek to conform the totality of physical and psychological life around themselves. But this technocratic tyranny is ultimately defeated, and it's no coincidence how it's vanquished. If you know the story, right, it's through the intervention of King Arthur's heir, Ransom, and the resuscitation of Merlin's body that had been lying buried in a timeless state, and his cursing of the leaders of the technocracy. Thus, the modern age is ultimately defeated by a return. The reawakening of a pre-modern world, a classical medieval world that is not dead, but lying in a timeless state, waiting to rise again. Similarly, retraditionalization is awakening all over the world, bringing to the fore pre-modern beliefs and practices that are challenging the dominance of modernity. As it turns out, we can return. We can go back. On the one hand, postmodernist thought is calling out the self-defeating notion of scientifically inspired epistemology and ethics, and on the other hand, a renewal of religious nationalism is arousing pre-modern beliefs and practices as mechanisms of resistance against the anti-cultural processes of globalization and its secular aristocracy, all the while affording the opportunity for an educational renaissance, precisely the kind championed by Lewis as necessary for a flourishing humanity. Standing at the dawn of the 21st century, we can see that Lewis's warning and wish have come together. The abolition of man does in fact turn out to be a prophecy, not one regarding the mortality of a truly human civilization, but rather its recovery, its renewal, indeed, its reawakening. Thank you, and God bless.
All right, lots to think about and plenty to discuss. A couple things just as we go. Our discussion groups will start at 11, as will the first round of lunch. If you need lunch tickets, that is, if you're an off-campus student or faculty and staff, Julianne Owens is at the back, and she will give you a lunch ticket. Get that if you want one. And also, there are copies of the lecture. Please grab those as you go out. Enjoy your discussions and lunch, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.